All right guys, today we're gonna be talking about slow motion. We are here at a cable park where wakeboarders are jumping behind us. As you can see, I might be a little wet already because I've been sprayed a few times. And what we're going to be doing today is we're gonna be shooting a lot of handheld footage at different frame rates and then slowing it down to get really nice looking slow motion. Throughout this section, I'm gonna be shooting in 24 frames a second, 30 frames a second, 60 frames a second, and then 120 frames per second. Now keep in mind that every camera is going to be able to do different frame rates at different resolutions. The GH5 that we're shooting on here can shoot at 4K 60 frames per second, but if we want to go any faster than that, we have to drop down to 1080. So when we start shooting at 120 frames per second, I'm going to be shooting at 1080. Now there's some other quirks about this camera as well. For instance, when we start shooting above 60 frames per second, we have to go in this feature called variable frame rate, and we lose features like autofocus. Now, as you can imagine, with these guys jumping over our heads and jumping right next to us, there's absolutely no way that we're gonna be able to autofocus on them while they're actually jumping. So what I'm going to be doing throughout this entire shoot today is I'm going to be pre-focusing, usually on the front of the jump that they're gonna be coming off of. I'm going to focus with a wide open aperture on this lens. It's probably gonna be around f5.6, and then I'm going to stop down to give myself even more depth of field. Keep in mind that I also really wanna be shooting with a quick shutter speed. I don't want any motion blur here. As you can see, I am in a somewhat sketchy boat. We've got David and Patrick helping me out here, dollying me around. Hopefully we're not sinking at the moment, but let's see what type of clips we can get here. So right now I'm shooting in 120 frames per second in 1080p. As you can see, I'm just hand holding this because there's absolutely no way I could get a tripod in this rickety boat. And even if I could, it's gonna be bouncing all over the place. Because I'm shooting at such a high frame rate, the jitters of hand holding a camera are mitigated a lot. So even if you don't have a stabilized lens or a stabilized camera, you will find that you're actually able to shoot with just your hands if you're shooting at a high enough frame rate. So it kind of looks like I'm bouncing up and down as I'm taking these shots, but you can see when we play this footage back, it actually looks pretty smooth. There is some software out there that can actually interpolate frames. So if you're shooting in 60 frames per second, you could ramp that up to 1,000 frames per second, but you need each of those frames to be really, really sharp. You don't want any motion blur at all. So normally I like shooting with a slower shutter speed, but for stuff like this, I'm going to shoot with a much faster shutter speed, which gives me the option, if I want to add more frames in post-processing, I can actually do it. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that your camera has a set maximum bit rate, and that's how much data it's processing per second. So the higher you raise your frame rate, the more frames per second your camera is capturing, the lower quality each frame is going to be. And that's why with many cameras, they can shoot at a higher frame rate, but you have to lower the resolution. With the GH5, I can shoot at 4K 60 frames per second, but if I want to go above that, then I have to drop down to 1080. Some cameras let you go even faster if you drop down to 720. Now, something that is pretty common knowledge with the GH5 especially is that this camera can go all the way to 180 frames per second, but after 120 frames per second, you do see a significant decrease in image quality. So I almost never shoot at 180 frames per second with this specific camera. I just try to keep it at 120 so that I can get decent looking 1080 footage. Now, whatever camera you have, just make sure that you do these tests. Go ahead and take the same clip over and over again at different frame rates, at different bit rates. Figure out the quality of the footage that you're trying to get, and you'll figure out where that line is. And maybe you won't want to shoot over 60 frames per second, or in this case, over 120 frames per second. So Patrick is slowly rowing us back to shore. I think we've got tons of good clips with the GH5 here. Let's head back into the studio and we'll get into Premiere, and I'll show you what you can do with this slow-mo footage. All right guys, welcome back to Premiere. Now, you've already seen the introduction to Premiere, and in that we worked with some slow-mo footage, so I'm not going to go through all of that all over again, but there are two things in particular that I wanted to talk about in this section. First of all, you'll notice here that I just have 2 clips here in my Premiere. And if you look at the stats here, one of them says that it was filmed in 24 frames per second at 1080, and the other one says that it was filmed in 60 frames per second in 4K. And I know for a fact that I never shot anything in 24 frames per second in 1080. But for a lot of the wakeboard shoot, I was shooting in a variable frame rate. Now, most DSLRs do not have this option, but professional video cameras do have this option, and the GH5 is kind of mimicking that. And basically what you do is you tell your camera the foundational frame rate that you're going to be playing everything back at, and then you can set a variable frame rate from that point, which is either slower or faster than that. But the basic premise is that even though I was shooting at 120 frames per second, the camera is playing back the footage at 24 frames per second, or 23.976 frames per second. And so when I take that file from the camera and I put it on a computer, the computer is also going to think that it was shot in 24 frames per second, and Premiere is also going to think that it's 24 frames per second, because that's what it's playing back at. Most DSLRs that you're probably used to are working like the second file here, which is 60 frames per second at 4K. So there's a few different things that we can do with these files, but the first thing that I want to point out is that we don't want to drag these files onto our timeline to automatically create a sequence, because it's going to create the wrong sequence settings for us. Basically, I want to create a sequence that is 4K 24 frames per second, or 23.976 frames per second. So if I were to drag the first file down here to our timeline and drop it off, it's going to create a sequence that's the same name as the file that we dropped in there. But if I right click on this and I go down to sequence settings, you'll see that we have a 1920 by 1080 sequence that is shot in 23.976 frames per second. Now the second clip is going to do something kind of similar, but instead of changing the actual resolution from 4K to 1080, it's going to choose the wrong frame rate. So if I drag this into the timeline, and then once again I right click on this and go to sequence settings, it is a 4K sequence, that's what we want, but if you look at the frame rate, it's 59.94. And I don't want the finished product to be played back at 60 frames per second. I want it to be played back at 24 frames per second. So there's a few different things that we could do. One thing I could do is just go in here and change it manually to what I want, which in this case would be 23.976 frames per second. Or I would just manually make the sequence myself. So I'm gonna delete this sequence, and I'm gonna click this button right down here, click sequence. For this, I don't really care what I choose here, because I'm just gonna click settings and I'm gonna do it manually. So 23.976 frames per second is what I want. And then for the resolution, I want 3840 by 2160. And I'm going to click OK. So now it's created a sequence with the actual settings that we wanna work with. So let's first drop this first file onto our timeline. And you're gonna see that we get a warning that says it doesn't match the sequence settings, and that's because we just made a 4K timeline, but this isn't 4K footage. This was shot in 1080, but I'm going to go ahead and keep existing settings. Now, as you can see, it's way too small, but we've dealt with this before. So you guys know that you can go to Effects Controls, just click on the file down here, and then I'm going to type in 200%, and that's going to zoom in, and it's going to make the 1080 footage fill the frame. I'm also gonna go over here and I'm gonna grab the second file, which was shot in 4K 60. And you can see this fits the frame perfectly, but you'll notice that when I watch it back, it plays back in real time. So right now what it's doing is it's not showing all 60 of those frames every second. So even though we shot at 60 frames per second, it's playing back at 24 frames per second, because that's what our timeline settings are. So there's a few different things that we can do. One thing we could do, we could just right click on this and we could go to speed and duration, and we could slow this down. We could slow it down to 40%. Or what I like to do is right click up here, modify, interpret footage, Assume frame rate 23.976 frames per second, okay. And then because this had already been dragged onto the timeline, it didn't get stretched out. So we have to remember to grab over here and pull it out, because now it's going to be longer on the timeline, because instead of playing back in real time, it's playing back in slow motion. So if we watch this again, you'll notice that now it's playing back in slow motion. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and just delete the sound off of these clips just by holding Alt and clicking just the bottom part of each of these clips. I'm going to hit delete to delete these. And let me show you now how to speed ramp something. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to find the key points of action here, where this rider is riding up here, he's doing the trick, he lands it, and that's probably the end of the video. And then I'm just gonna delete this. Now, if we watch this back, remember that the camera is shooting in a variable frame rate, so it's playing back in slow motion automatically, but I know that I shot this in 120 frames per second. Looks great, as you can see, but let's say you wanted the clip to start off in real time and then slowly move into slow motion. This is a really cool technique that a lot of people use when they're shooting slow-mo, and it's really easy to deal with in Premiere. First of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the part where I want it to go into slow-mo, and maybe like right where he's twisting, right there is where I want it to go into slow-mo. I'm gonna grab right here on the timeline and bring this up just so that I can see a little bit better. I'm gonna right click on this, go to Show Clip Keyframe, Time Remapping, Speed. Then what I'm going to do is click over here on the Pin tool, and I'm gonna make a point right here. Now I'm gonna zoom in so that you can see this a little bit more easily. And what I can do now, by clicking and dragging this line, I can change the speed of each of these different parts of the clip. So I've kind of made a cut in the middle, and I say, at the beginning part of this, I want a totally different speed than the end part of this. So right now I can just drag up and down, and you can see this percentage changing. I'm gonna go to 500%. And you may ask, why 500%? Well, let's bring up a calculator and I'll show you the math here. If we have 120 frames per second divided by 24 frames per second, because that's the actual timeline that we're working with here, you can see that it goes in 5 times. So basically I need to speed up the slow motion footage 500%, and that will give us real-time playback. So you can see that it's playing back at 500% speed here, and then back here it's playing in slow-mo, which was shot at 120 frames per second. Let's watch this and see what it looks like. That looks great. Let's go ahead and make another point right here. So once again, once he's right about to land, let's go ahead and set this to 500% as well. All right, let's play this back. You can see he comes in real time. In the air, it goes to slow-mo, and then boom, it goes to full speed again. Now, let's say that you want to ramp that speed, because right now it's pretty abrupt. It's like real time and then immediately slow motion and then real time again. What you can do is you can come down here and you can grab these things, these little tabs, and you can drag this out. And so this line is representing the actual frame rate and the playback speed. So the longer this incline is, the slower the ramp will be. So let's watch this. I think we could probably go even further than that. That looks awesome, and then we'll add another ramp down here. And let's play that. So that's it, guys. That was a very simple tutorial on how to speed ramp your footage in Adobe Premiere. Keep in mind, the one thing that people are going to get hung up on here is what your actual sequence settings are, what's your resolution, what's your frame rate on the sequence in Premiere itself. and then what is the resolution and what is the frame rate that you actually shot the footage on. If you can keep those things clear in your mind, this is going to be a breeze for you.